Today on Rapid Report, a trade war that was supposed to demonstrate American strength has instead exposed one of the most consequential economic miscalculations in modern U.S. history. What began as an aggressive tariff offensive against Canada, targeting steel, aluminum, lumber, dairy, automobiles, and hundreds of billions of dollars in cross-border trade, was expected to force Ottawa into rapid concessions. Washington believed Canada had no leverage, no alternatives, no cards to play. But what unfolded shocked policymakers, rattled financial markets, and triggered ripple effects across the global economy. Instead of capitulating, Canada responded with a highly strategic, multi-layered counteroffensive. Politically targeted retaliatory tariffs aimed directly at key American states, quiet but powerful energy leverage that sent oil futures soaring, and a year-long trade diversification strategy that reduced its dependence on the U.S. market before the first tariff even hit. As American consumers saw rising gas prices, higher home construction costs, and increased car prices, prominent voices on Wall Street began to speak out. Legendary investor Warren Buffett called trade wars economic self-harm, reinforcing what markets were beginning to realize. This confrontation was not unfolding as planned. Tonight, we go beyond the headlines. We examine how Canada outmaneuvered Washington. We break down the economic fallout inside the United States. We analyze the strategic damage to U.S. credibility and global trade leadership. And we ask the critical question, has the long-term balance of economic power quietly shifted? This is not just a trade dispute. This is a lesson in modern economic warfare. Stay with us. The United States' aggressive tariff offensive against Canada, framed in Washington as a show of economic strength, ultimately evolved into one of the most damaging trade miscalculations in modern American history. What was expected to be a swift capitulation by Ottawa instead became a case study in strategic preparation, economic leverage, and political precision. Far from being cornered, Canada responded with a multi-layered counter-strategy that not only blunted the immediate impact of U.S. tariffs, but reshaped long-term trade dynamics in ways that may permanently alter North American economic relations. The confrontation exposed vulnerabilities in the American approach to trade coercion, triggered domestic economic consequences across multiple industries, and drew unusually sharp criticism from business leaders such as Warren Buffett, who publicly described trade wars as economic self-harm. By the time the dust settled, the costs, economic, political, and strategic, were borne disproportionately inside the United States, while Canada emerged having strengthened its global diversification and diplomatic positioning. Opening claim: the unexpected victor. At the outset of the confrontation, the White House narrative was confident, even dismissive. Senior officials argued that Canada had no cards to play, asserting that the structural imbalance of trade dependence left Ottawa with little room to maneuver. The belief in Washington was that tariffs would force rapid concessions, perhaps within days. Instead, the result was described by analysts as spectacular in its reversal. Rather than capitulating, Canada humiliated Washington in the court of global opinion and demonstrated that economic statecraft, when carefully designed and patiently prepared, can neutralize even the largest economy in the world. What was intended as a demonstration of American dominance became a cautionary tale about misreading an ally's leverage. Trump announces unprecedented tariffs. Under the leadership of Donald Trump, the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, dairy, automobiles, and a wide array of manufactured goods. More than $400 billion in bilateral trade flows were affected, arguably the largest punitive trade action taken by the U.S. against a close ally since the era of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. The scale alone shocked markets. Investors, accustomed to North American economic integration under decades of free trade agreements, suddenly faced a rupture in what had been one of the most stable trading corridors in the world. The White House expectation was simple: Canada's economy was deeply intertwined with the United States, and the pressure would be too intense to withstand. But this assumption ignored both structural realities and quiet preparation. Canada's retaliation, precision, and political targeting. Ottawa's response was immediate but measured. Rather than escalating blindly, Canadian officials deployed what analysts described as one of the most sophisticated retaliatory strategies ever crafted by a middle power against a superpower. Tariffs were imposed on bourbon from Kentucky, dairy products from Wisconsin, steel from Pennsylvania, and agricultural goods from multiple Midwestern states, many of them politically critical to the Trump coalition. The strategy was not random. It was politically targeted, calibrated to maximize pressure on influential constituencies. This was economic counterpunching with surgical precision. Members of Congress from affected states began voicing concerns almost immediately. Lobbying groups intensified pressure. Industry associations demanded exemptions. What Washington assumed would be one-sided pain began to reverberate domestically. The energy leverage few considered perhaps the most underestimated factor was energy. Canada supplies approximately 60% of U.S. crude oil imports and nearly half of natural gas imports. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest, are engineered specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. Substitution is neither simple nor immediate. Ottawa signaled the possibility of export levies on energy shipments. The mere suggestion sent oil futures upward. Refineries warned of potential shutdown risks if supply chains were disrupted. Gasoline prices rose sharply in multiple states. The United States had imposed tariffs on manufactured goods, but Canada held leverage in commodities that directly affect American consumers' daily lives. Energy is not just another sector. It is foundational to economic stability. A year-long diversification strategy. What made Canada's response especially effective was that it had been prepared long before the tariffs were announced. Over the previous year, Canada quietly expanded and strengthened trade ties through agreements such as the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, and participation in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Engagements with the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, and India deepened. Canadian exporters pre-secured alternative buyers for agricultural and industrial goods. Ports and logistics networks were optimized to redirect flows. Financial hedging strategies were put in place. By the time U.S. tariffs hit, Canada needed the American market less than Washington assumed. Diversification had reduced vulnerability. This was not reactive policy. It was anticipatory strategy. Warren Buffett's devastating critique. The political optics worsened when Warren Buffett publicly criticized the tariff strategy. Buffett described trade wars as confessions of weakness and reiterated a core economic truth. Tariffs are paid primarily by domestic consumers and importers, not foreign governments. His words carried enormous weight in financial markets. When the chairman of Berkshire Hathaway shifts capital away from sectors exposed to U.S. policy volatility, investors take notice. Markets interpreted his comments as a warning that the trade war was not a temporary negotiating tactic but a structural risk to economic predictability. Confidence eroded. Economic fallout inside the United States. The domestic economic consequences materialized quickly. Lumber prices surged by approximately 22%, adding an estimated $14,000 to the cost of new homes. Gasoline prices increased by more than 30 cents per gallon within days in some regions. Automobile prices rose by roughly $2,000 per vehicle as supply chains absorbed tariff costs. Farmers, already sensitive to export volatility, lost more than $2 billion in contracts. Viral videos circulated showing canceled Canadian orders and surplus crops without buyers. The cumulative effect was inflationary pressure, consumer dissatisfaction, and business uncertainty. What had been framed as punishment for Canada increasingly looked like a tax on American households. Global strategic damage. Beyond the immediate economic metrics, the deeper cost may be strategic. Allies in Europe and Asia began questioning U.S. reliability. If Washington was willing to impose sweeping tariffs on Canada, a long-standing ally and defense partner, what assurance did others have? The European Union, Japan, Australia, and South Korea accelerated diversification strategies to reduce dependence on the U.S. market. Even countries traditionally aligned with Washington recalibrated risk exposure. Meanwhile, China capitalized diplomatically, arguing that the United States was unstable and unpredictable in its economic leadership. Global trade leadership relies not only on market size, but on trust. Once eroded, trust is extraordinarily difficult to restore. Two possible paths forward. At this stage, two broad trajectories remain. 1. De-escalation. Washington could walk back tariffs, negotiate stabilization mechanisms, and attempt to restore confidence. Such a move might halt immediate damage, but trust, once broken, does not reset instantly. Businesses remember volatility. Governments remember unpredictability. 2. Escalation spiral. Alternatively, escalation could deepen. Energy levies combined with winter demand spikes could produce more severe economic consequences. Supply chain reorientation could become permanent. Diplomatic fractures could widen. In this scenario, the rupture becomes structural rather than tactical. The irreversible question. History will likely judge this episode not solely by short-term economic fluctuations, but by long-term strategic outcomes. The United States entered the confrontation expecting dominance. Instead, it encountered preparation. Canada's calibrated retaliation, energy leverage, and diversified trade architecture demonstrated that even asymmetrical economic relationships contain hidden balances of power. The most lasting damage may not be measured in dollars, but in credibility. Global trade leadership depends on predictability, alliances, and trust. Once partners begin building parallel systems to hedge against U.S. volatility, the center of gravity in global trade shifts incrementally away from Washington. If that shift continues, the miscalculation will be remembered not as a temporary policy error, but as a turning point. And in that assessment lies the central conclusion. Canada did not merely withstand the tariff offensive, it outmaneuvered it. The strategic miscalculation. Misreading interdependence. At the heart of Washington's failure was a fundamental misreading of interdependence. U.S. policymakers assumed that because Canada exports a significant share of its goods to the American market, the relationship was asymmetrically dependent. On paper, that appeared true. But interdependence is not measured solely by export ratios. It is measured by substitution costs. Canada's exports, particularly heavy crude oil, uranium, potash, lumber, and critical minerals, are not easily replaceable in the short term. American refineries, construction industries, and agricultural sectors are structurally integrated with Canadian supply chains. The cost and time required to re-engineer that integration were vastly underestimated. In essence, Washington viewed trade as leverage without fully calculating how deeply embedded Canadian inputs were inside American production systems. This was not traditional dependency, it was systemic integration. Supply chain. Shockwaves and structural inflation. The tariffs did not simply increase prices, they injected structural instability into North American supply chains. Industries that operate on thin margins, home construction, automotive assembly, and agricultural exports depend on predictability. When tariffs alter cost structures overnight, firms face three options. 1. Absorb the cost, reducing profits and investment. 2. Pass the cost to consumers, fueling inflation. 3. Exit or relocate operations. In many cases, companies chose a combination of all three. The lumber price spike, for example, did more than raise housing costs. It tightened mortgage affordability, slowed construction starts, and affected employment in downstream industries. Similarly, higher steel and aluminum costs reverberated through manufacturing, from appliances to machinery. What began as a political maneuver became a macroeconomic pressure amplifier. Financial market reaction. Risk, premium on U.S. policy. Financial markets do not react solely to present conditions. They price future uncertainty. The tariff episode introduced a new variable into global investment decisions: the unpredictability of U.S. trade policy toward allies. This unpredictability functions as a risk premium. When multinational corporations calculate long-term investments, factories, pipelines, refineries, they require stable trade frameworks. If those frameworks can be altered abruptly for political leverage, investors demand higher returns to compensate for risk, or they redirect capital elsewhere. This is where the critique by figures like Warren Buffett carried disproportionate influence. When a long-term investor signals concern about policy volatility, markets internalize that signal. Over time, this can reduce the attractiveness of the U.S. as the default hub of global capital allocation. Canada's diplomatic leverage, reframing the narrative. Another dimension often overlooked is narrative control. Canada positioned itself internationally not as a victim, but as a defender of rules-based trade. By responding proportionally and strategically rather than emotionally, it maintained credibility with Europe and Asia. This framing mattered. Global trade disputes are not only economic conflicts, they are diplomatic performances. Canada's measured response reinforced its image as a predictable partner, while the U.S. appeared confrontational. In geopolitics, perception shapes alignment. When allies perceive instability, they quietly hedge. Energy as strategic deterrence. Energy was not merely a bargaining chip, it was a deterrent. The mere suggestion of export levies on crude oil exposed how energy interdependence constrains policy escalation. Even without implementing full restrictions, Canada demonstrated its capacity to inflict significant economic pain. This revelation shifted the psychological balance of the trade war. Washington recognized that escalation could trigger cascading energy disruptions, particularly during peak demand seasons. In effect, Canada's energy leverage functioned like a stabilizing counterweight, limiting how far the U.S. could push without harming itself. The China factor. Strategic narrative advantage. While the confrontation unfolded, China observed carefully. Beijing has long argued that the United States weaponizes trade relationships for political objectives. The dispute with Canada, one of America's closest allies, provided rhetorical ammunition for that narrative. Emerging markets evaluating supply chain alignment saw a cautionary signal. If even Canada could be targeted, no partner was immune. China used the episode diplomatically to portray itself as a more stable long-term partner, especially within Asia-Pacific trade frameworks. The irony is stark. A policy designed to strengthen U.S. leverage may have accelerated the diversification of global trade away from U.S.-centric systems. Domestic political backlash and institutional strain trade wars rarely remain abstract policy debates. They become electoral issues. Affected industries mobilized. Governors and senators from impacted states pressed for relief. Business lobbies intensified their influence. The political coalition supporting aggressive tariffs began to fracture under economic pressure. This exposed another structural weakness. In a highly interconnected economy, sectoral pain rapidly translates into political vulnerability. Moreover, internal divisions within the U.S. government over trade strategy undermined coherence. Mixed signals from different agencies created further uncertainty. Strategic consistency is essential in economic statecraft. Without it, leverage dissipates. Long-term structural consequences. The most profound consequences may unfold gradually. 1. Permanent diversification. Canadian firms that successfully redirected exports to Europe and Asia may never return to previous dependency levels on the U.S. market. 2. Supply chain reorientation. American companies wary of volatility may diversify away from Canadian inputs, but at higher costs, reducing overall efficiency. 3. Erosion of U.S. leadership. Allies may strengthen regional trade blocs independent of U.S. oversight, accelerating multipolar trade governance. 4. Credibility gap. Future U.S. trade threats may carry less weight if counterparts believe Washington underestimates counter-leverage. Trade wars are often evaluated in short-term GDP terms, but their real legacy lies in how they reshape strategic architecture. The core lesson. The confrontation demonstrated a critical truth about modern economic power. Size alone does not guarantee dominance. Preparation, diversification, and strategic clarity can neutralize even overwhelming scale. Canada did not win because it was larger. It won because it anticipated, prepared, and targeted. The United States did not lose solely because of tariffs. It lost because it misjudged the balance of interdependence and underestimated the political and structural sophistication of its counterpart. The irreversibility question. Revisited. Is the damage irreversible? In economics, reversibility depends on trust. Tariffs can be lifted overnight. But investment patterns, supply chains, and diplomatic alignments, once reoriented, rarely revert completely. If global actors conclude that U.S. trade policy can shift unpredictably against allies, diversification becomes a permanent hedge. That may be the most enduring consequence of this episode. Not higher prices or lost contracts, but a subtle yet lasting recalibration of global economic gravity. And once gravity shifts, even slightly, it rarely returns to its previous center. The tariffs may have been announced with confidence, but history will likely judge this episode not by the rhetoric, but by the consequences. What was intended as leverage became liability. What was meant to project strength revealed vulnerability. And what was assumed to be a short-term negotiation tactic may have triggered long-term structural damage to alliances, supply chains, and global trust in U.S. economic leadership. Canada's response demonstrated that in today's interconnected world, preparation can outweigh size, and strategic patience can outperform raw power. The bigger question now is not who won the trade battle, but what comes next. Will Washington recalibrate and restore confidence? Or will the aftershocks continue to reshape North American trade and global economic alignments? The answers will define more than a single dispute. They will shape the future of international trade itself. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like this video, share it with others who want deeper insight beyond the headlines, and most importantly, subscribe to Rapid Report so you never miss critical global developments explained with clarity and depth. Your engagement helps us continue delivering serious analysis in a world of fast-moving news. Thank you for watching Rapid Report. We'll see you in the next briefing.